Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Now, some of us were at the picnic yesterday, and we were eating and being merry, and drinking. I should have meant that too, but I said last night that slogan, if you've heard it before, you've heard that before, eat, drink, and be merry? Yes. For tomorrow we die. That's the important part. That is the philosophy of hedonism. Hedonists believed that because there may be no tomorrow, we should enjoy life as much as possible today. And it's really kind of a logical conclusion if you think about how fragile life is. In a sense, because life is so fragile and there is no promise of tomorrow, it makes sense that we should enjoy life now instead of putting off things till tomorrow. But my guess is that most of us as Christians just instinctively sense that there is something wrong with a philosophy that says the highest goal of the human person is to seek as much pleasure as possible today, for there may be no tomorrow. And that instinct would be right. You see, because even though both Christians and hedonists recognize that life is fragile, there is one very important difference between the two. You see, hedonists recognize life is fragile, but they have no faith. Christians, on the other hand, recognize that life is fragile, but they do have faith. And faith makes all the difference. In our second reading today from the letter to Hebrews, we're told that faith is the realization of what is hoped for and evidence of things not seen. We're looking at chapter 11 of Hebrews, that was verse 1. Our readings really spans between verses 8 and 19. After the letter to the Hebrews tells us that faith is the realization of what is hoped for and evidence of things not seen, he begins to outline a series of biblical characters who live by faith. He talks about Abel, and then Enoch, and then Noah. And then eventually he gets to Sarah and Abraham, which is the portion that we read from today. And the author tells us that all of these biblical characters lived by faith. They heard the promise of God of a bigger picture, of a distant future for them. And they accepted that in faith, and they lived their lives accordingly. And then the author tells us something very important. Verse 13, he says to us that all of these characters died in faith. They did not receive what had been promised, but saw it and greeted it from afar. In other words, each of these characters was promised something from God, but they actually didn't see that promise fulfilled in their lifetime. And yet they held on to that promise and believed in it in faith. And because of that, they could pass that faith on to future generations, many of whom would see that promise fulfilled, but still many of us, even to this day, await the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises. But you see, all of that is living in faith. And so the author can conclude that faith is the realization of what is hoped for and evidence of things not seen. Another way of maybe rephrasing it would be to say that faith is confidence in what we hope for will come true. And it's assurance of what we hope for will come true, even though we may never see it ourselves. Faith is the confidence of what is hoped for and the assurance of things not seen. If we have faith, then, and face the reality that life is fragile, then we act very differently from the hedonists who have no faith. You see, hedonists who are following a secular philosophy can see no long-term future, no big picture beyond themselves. So their perspective is in the short term, and it becomes self-absorbed, which leads them to seek pleasure today, for tomorrow they die. But people of faith can place their lives in a larger context. We can look to the long term in hope, even if we might not live to see that it is accomplished ourselves. And even more important, because we can see the big picture, we can focus our attention beyond ourselves and include others in our worldview. You see, without faith, those who see the fragility of life seek pleasure. But with faith, we who see that same fragility seek goodness and justice. That's why we who have faith need to be about the things that are important in life now, but also have a larger sense of the big picture, because it is by faith that we can hope for the things that God has promised us, even if we do not see them accomplished ourselves. When we see our nation torn by racism and ethnic chauvinism, and we see the consequences of that hatred in mass shootings and mass incarceration, God's promises inspire us to work for unity and charity, even though we may never see it ourselves. When we see poverty and violence in our own neighborhood that result in drug addiction and human trafficking and even arson, God's promises inspire us to work for justice, even though we may never see it ourselves. As people of faith, we search for goodness and justice in a world that has become cynical about whether any of those things can really exist. As a people of faith, we continue to strive for what is just and right, even in the uncertainty of tomorrow. We do all of this in faith because we can have confidence in what we hope for and assurance in what we may never live to see. So celebrate the life that you have been given now, and seek also the goodness and justice that God has promised to us all. For it is by faith that we understand that the world is bigger than just ourselves. And it is by faith that we can have confidence that God's goodness and justice will ultimately prevail. And if you don't believe any of that stuff, well then go ahead. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may indeed die. Amen.
Amen.